out of 400 top-tier applicants from a place like Stanford, people who have succeeded in every academic hurdle ever placed in front of them, maybe 4 to 6 get offers.
Right. And that is just the beginning of the math. Worldwide, a top-tier management consulting firm might hire 100 analysts in a single year. And within 2 years, 90 of those 100 are explicitly encouraged to leave.
They're managed out.
Exactly. They are managed out. That is a 90% attrition rate for the top 0.01% of global academic achievers.
Which means we aren't just talking about a competitive job interview today.
No, we're looking at a brutal, mathematically ruthless filter. One that is specifically designed to isolate a highly, highly specific type of human mind.
Because the mathematics of that filter are terrifying when you realize the stakes.
Oh, absolutely. The individuals who survive that gauntlet, they are the ones handed the keys to the global economy. They are the minds advising Fortune 500 CEOs, restructuring multinational supply chains, and, deciding whether a massive factory in Ohio stays open or if a workforce in Berlin gets slashed by 30%.
Welcome to this deep dive. If you've ever wondered how the gears of global corporate power actually turn, you are exactly where you need to be.
It is a totally different world behind those closed doors.
It really is. Today, we are conducting an autopsy on the hidden mechanics of the boardroom. We have access to an exhaustive insider brain dump from a former top-tier analyst. It's effectively a masterclass in the secret language of global business.
A literal blueprint of how these decisions get made.
Right, and our mission today is to unpack how power, money, and these massive structural macroeconomic forces are manipulated by this hyperlinear elite group of thinkers. And for you, the listener, I want to be clear, this isn't just an abstract theory.
Not at all.
This is a shortcut to understanding the invisible architecture that governs the products you buy, the companies you work for, and the global markets we all rely on.
I think it's vital to frame this properly from the start, because the analytical frameworks we are dissecting today, they're not theoretical business school exercises. They are the literal tools used to alter reality.
Like when an airline merges.
Exactly. When an airline merges, or when a global media conglomerate enters an emerging market like China, or, when a pharmaceutical giant decides to just pivot its entire research division. The justification for those tectonic shifts usually originates from the exact psychological and analytical frameworks we're about to decode.
So let's unpack this from the ground up, because to understand the filter, we have to deeply understand the environment these people are being filtered for. What exactly is this elite gauntlet testing for, and why does it dictate the behavior of the global economy?
Well, to understand the filter, you have to look at the structural economic tension between global consulting firms and their multinational clients. It's a really simple, albeit brutal dynamic.
All of the money.
Right. Always. Consulting firms charge exorbitant, almost unimaginable fees. We are talking millions of dollars for just a few weeks of analysis. And the clients, naturally, they feel the pain of those fees.
Sure. They want ROI on that spend.
Right. So there is this constant crushing pressure from the client side to do the work faster and with fewer people. They will look at a proposal and ask, does this really take 8 weeks? Can you do it in 6? Do you really need 4 consultants on site? Why not 3?
So the structural force at play is that eternal corporate mandate, do more with less, but applied directly to human cognitive capital.
Exactly. And because of that tension, consulting resources are continuously pushed beyond their absolute limits. Say it's a new client and the firm is trying to establish a beachhead. They might staff 3 people on the project, but guarantee the output of 5.
Which creates a perpetual pressure cooker.
A massive one. And when a firm brings a new person onto a team, like a first-year analyst fresh out of a master's program, that new person's internal value is effectively negative at first.
Wait, negative?
Yeah, they are a liability. The senior team members are already pulling 90-hour weeks doing the work of 2 people. Literally, no one has the bandwidth to break in the new kid. So the fundamental question the firm has to answer during the interview process isn't just an inquiry into a candidate's IQ.
It's an exercise in extreme risk assessment.
Precisely.
There's this incredibly vivid anecdote in the source material that perfectly captures the reality of this risk assessment. The source describes being a 21-year-old single guy. And because all his senior colleagues were married with kids and, they wanted to be home on the weekends, the firm literally dropped him off, completely alone, at the Ritz-Carlton in Cleveland for 18 months.
Just think about that. A 21-year-old left alone in Cleveland. And his assignment was staggering. There was a broken $200 million division of a Fortune 500 company.
And the mandate handed to him was simply, it's broken, go fix it.
That was the entirety of the instruction. Virtually zero supervision. A senior partner might fly in, once a week for an afternoon meeting just to manage the executive relationship and keep the CEO calm. But otherwise, this 21-year-old was totally on his own to diagnose and restructure a $250 million corporate entity.
Which completely changes how you view the interview process. When we look at it from the outside, we see the complex case studies, the impossible mental math questions, the brain teasers, and we assume the interviewers are looking for a textbook, academically perfect answer. But they aren't, are they?
Not at all. You have to remember, the people conducting these interviews are not professional HR staff. They are working consultants who are taking an hour out of their crushing, sleep-deprived schedules to evaluate a candidate.
Right.
When they look across that mahogany table, they are silently asking one terrifying question. If I hire you and I drop you off alone with the CEO of a Fortune 500 company on a Tuesday morning while I fly to London, are you going to get me fired?
Are you going to be screwed?
Exactly. It's not a test of raw intellect. It's a test of operational independence and extreme risk mitigation. Which brings us to a phenomenon that I think most people completely misunderstand about this world. There is a fatal flaw that highly technical, brilliant minds bring into this arena.
It's the tragedy of the pure genius in the corporate sphere.
It really is. The source shares a fascinating story about interviewing a candidate who was the absolute #1 physics graduate from IIT. That's the premier technical institute in India.
So out of over 1 billion people, this individual is at the absolute apex of mathematical and scientific brilliance.
Completely unmatched intellect. So the interviewer asks him a seemingly simple business question to start the case. He says, how do you figure out what a customer wants?
A basic market research question.
Right. But to a physicist, human desire is a complex variable tracking problem. So the candidate immediately begins designing a theoretical, highly complex GPS radio tracking system, utilizing a Poisson distribution algorithm to mathematically map and predict exact customer movements and purchasing desires.
Wait, a Poisson distribution? For you listening who haven't sat in an advanced statistics class recently, what is that actually used for, and why is it the wrong tool here?
Well, a Poisson distribution is a brilliant mathematical concept. It's used for predicting the probability of a given number of events occurring in a fixed interval of time or space.
Like why?
Think of predicting how many radioactive particles will decay in a minute, or how many buses will arrive at a station between noon and 1 o'clock. It assumes these events happen independently of each other.
I see.
So the physicist tried to model human desire, what a customer wants, as if it were a series of independent, random mechanical events that could be captured through sheer computational force.
Which is mathematically stunning, but functionally useless to a business. So what was the correct consultant answer?
The correct answer was, you jump on a plane, you fly to the customer, you ask them what they want, and you fly back to the office that afternoon.
See, I have to push back on this, though. If we are talking about optimizing global systems, multinational supply chains, international market entries, multi-billion-dollar resource allocations, isn't precision always the ultimate goal?
You would think so.
Why would a global powerhouse firm actively reject the most precise, mathematically rigorous answer?
Because in global business, there is a massive structural difference between being precise and having enough information to make an actionable decision.
Expand on that.
In the hard sciences, precision is literal survival. If you are engineering a commercial airliner and your calculations are off by 2%, the aerodynamics fail, the plane crashes, and people die. The physicist is trained to find the one singular, mathematically perfect right answer to 3 significant decimal places. But in corporate strategy, if you are analyzing whether a newly proposed product will achieve a mandatory 50% gross margin, and your rapid back-of-the-napkin estimate says it will only hit 20%, you don't need to spend $200,000 and 3 weeks of computational modeling to figure out if it's exactly 21.4% or 19.8%.
Because you just killed a product either way.
Exactly. The binary decision remains exactly the same. Kill the low-margin product.
Yeah.
The consultant is optimizing for time and capital, not academic perfection. Highly technical minds struggle deeply with this because it violates their core training, and this introduces a foundational concept in the industry called boiling the ocean.
Let's explore that metaphor. Boiling the ocean.
If you need a cup of hot water, there are basically 2 physical ways to get it. You can take a single cup of water, put it on a stove, and heat it up. Or you can attempt to heat the entire planet's ocean to a rolling boil and then scoop out your single cup.
Both methods technically yield a cup of hot water.
Right, but one is efficient and the other is a catastrophic, impossible waste of energy. In a modern corporate environment, a company has terabytes of data, millions of customer records, decades of supply chain receipts. An analyst could request access to all of it and run a perfect algorithmic analysis. That is boiling the ocean.
And the era of big data makes the temptation to boil the ocean stronger than ever. But the true skill, the exact filter they are testing for, is the ability to ask the absolute minimum number of questions to extract the minimum amount of data required to make a safe, actionable decision.
They are evaluating your capacity for deliberate strategic ignorance. Can you confidently ignore 99% of the available data because you intuitively know exactly which 1% will drive the CEO's ultimate decision?
That is a staggering cognitive shift for an overachiever. It's not about proving how much you know. It's about proving you know exactly what you don't need to know.
Precisely.
But once you have that minimum actionable data, you face an entirely new problem: delivering it. And here is where the psychology of power comes into play. The source lays out 3 absolute rules for survival in this elite consulting world.
Rule number 1 is the foundation of their entire authority. Often right, never without data-driven justification. You never, ever open your mouth in a professional setting without empirical facts backing up your statement.
The source talked about the visceral experience of sitting in a Fortune 25 boardroom. You are at a massive mahogany table with seating for 70 people, individual microphones at every chair.
It's intimidating.
The pressure to contribute to prove your worth is immense, but the pressure not to say something stupid is even greater.
And stupid in this specific context doesn't mean unintelligent. It means speaking on instinct rather than proof. If a CEO asks your opinion on a peripheral issue and you aren't sure, you explicitly hedge. You announce, this is just brainstorming, I'm speaking anecdotally. But if they ask for a definitive answer and you lack the data, the correct response is to look the CEO of a global multinational dead in the eye and say, confidently, I have no idea. My knowledge base currently lacks the factual data to answer that question, but I will have the analysis for you by tomorrow morning.
Which takes a tremendous amount of nerve for a 20-something to say to a titan of industry. But let's look at the flip side. What happens when you do have the data, but the data reveals an incredibly ugly truth? Say the CEO's legacy pet project is bleeding tens of millions of dollars, or the company is hurtling toward a cliff.
This brings us to rule number 2, and it is the graveyard where brilliant people often get fired. You must be client-friendly. It does not matter if you have the mathematically perfect right answer. If you deliver that answer in a way that alienates, humiliates, or terrifies the client, you are entirely useless to the consulting firm.
The source uses a brilliant analogy here regarding a brain surgeon to explain the psychology.
It's a great analogy. Imagine you walk into a doctor's office for a routine checkup. The doctor is a world-renowned brain surgeon. He takes one look at you from across the room, runs 0 physical tests, asks you 0 questions about your medical history, and immediately says, I have terrible news. You are dying. I am drilling into your head right now or you won't live to see tomorrow.
As a patient, how do you react to that?
You run out of the room, you reject the surgery completely, and you probably call the medical board. And here is the critical psychological mechanism. Your reaction of total rejection is completely independent of whether the surgeon is actually medically correct.
Right, he might actually be right.
He might be an absolute genius who visually spotted the minute early physical signs of an impending aneurysm. He might be 100% empirically right. But because he did not build rapport, he didn't explain his diagnostic methodology, and he did not run the visible step-by-step tests that make a human being feel secure, you reject the life-saving intervention.
Applied to global business, a prodigy consultant can walk into a failing manufacturing company, instantly see that they need to divest an entire European division, cut operating margins, and fire 2,000 people.
Yes.
But if they just blurt out that conclusion in the first meeting without walking the executive team through the agonizing logic that led there, the corporate body rejects the surgery.
The corporate immune system attacks the consultant. They will reject the findings, attack the methodology, and the consultant gets removed from the project.
Which is a failure of communication, not analysis.
Exactly. The source goes deep into the psychology of cognitive learning styles here. He points out that only about 1/3 of the population are abstract learners. People who can hold a complex, rotating, multivariable concept in their heads and manipulate it without visual aids.
Which happens to be the exact cognitive style of the typical elite consultant.
Right. But the vast majority of people, including highly successful visionary CEOs, are visual or kinesthetic learners. They need to see a chart. They need a narrative structure. They need to physically walk through a factory floor to understand the bottleneck.
So if that hyper-abstract consultant explains their perfect data in a way that makes a powerful 60-year-old CEO feel mathematically incompetent,
Someone is getting fired, and I assure you it isn't the CEO. The consultant's job is not merely to discover the truth. It is to package the truth in a psychological wrapper that allows a powerful person to accept reality without losing face. If you cannot translate abstract calculus into a visual, intuitive narrative, you fail the filter.
which leads directly to rule number 3, the no asshole rule, or as it's more politely codified in corporate HR terms, the airport test.
The airport test asks the interviewer to imagine a scenario. If I am stuck in a massive snowstorm at O'Hare Airport for 9 hours with this candidate, am I going to want to jump out of the terminal window?
I think we've all worked with people who fail that test.
Oh, absolutely. But it goes much deeper than just evaluating whether someone makes pleasant small talk. The source highlights the inherent structural tension of being a 20-something outsider walking into a massive industrial firm to advise a veteran executive who has spent 40 years building the business.
That dynamic is inherently volatile. You have a kid armed with an Excel spreadsheet telling a grizzled industry veteran how to run his life's work.
Exactly. And the veteran is looking at the young consultant with extreme justified skepticism. Subconsciously, the veteran is looking for an excuse to write the consultant off as an arrogant, out-of-touch academic jerk.
They want to dismiss them.
They do. And if the consultant provides even a sliver of that excuse, a condescending tone, an eye roll, an impatient sigh, the relationship is permanently destroyed. And when the relationship is destroyed, the consultant can no longer collect the internal data they need from the client's staff to actually solve the case.
There was that fantastic anecdote from the source about his German colleague Wolfgang. It perfectly illustrates how efficiency can be a fatal flaw.
Wolfgang was highly analytical, hyper-efficient, the quintessential linear thinker. They were working on a project with clients in the American Midwest, an area where business culture is deeply rooted in relationship building.
You start a meeting by asking about the weekend, asking how their kid's baseball game went.
Right, but Wolfgang viewed this chit-chat as mathematically inefficient. He literally couldn't understand why they were wasting 5 minutes of billable time talking about weather.
He just wanted the data.
Just the data. The source had to pull him aside and coach him. Yes, Wolfgang, it is fundamentally inefficient. But if you want their willing cooperation to get the secure database access you need to do your highly efficient analysis, you must engage in the inefficiency of being human.
It's the ultimate paradox of this elite world. You are hired specifically for your ability to be a ruthless, linear, emotionless calculating machine. But your professional survival entirely depends on your ability to mask that machine behind high-level emotional intelligence and empathy.
It's a very difficult balance to strike.
It really is. Now, for you listening, if you're finding this breakdown of corporate psychology jarring, you aren't alone.
Yeah.
It forces us to look at our own workplaces, our own bosses, and our own communication styles completely differently. And if you value this kind of deep, long-form analysis, make sure to subscribe and like this deep dive. It really helps us keep bringing you these breakdowns.
There is so much to unpack here.
There is. So let's shift gears and actually open the toolkit. How do these minds dissect a failing multinational company when they are given nothing but a blank sheet of paper? You mentioned earlier that an elite consultant is looking to extract the absolute minimum data required. How do they physically do that without boiling the ocean?
Well, the source compares the classic Harvard Business School case method to the consulting interview case method. At Harvard, a student is handed a 21-page document filled with historical charts, macroeconomic history, and financial data, and asked to write an analysis.
So the data is provided, the test is interpretation.
Exactly. But in the interview, and in the real world of strategy consulting, the consultant is handed a blank piece of paper and given one vague sentence. Profits at Omega Corporation are down 20% over the last 2 quarters. Fix it.
So the primary skill isn't analyzing data that's handed to you. The core competency is extracting the right data from the void.
And they achieve this using highly structured, rigid, linear frameworks. It prevents them from wandering blindly. The most foundational of these is the profitability framework.
Profit equals revenue minus costs.
Right. On the surface, it is elegantly simple, almost insultingly so. But the golden, unbreakable rule within this framework is to segment and isolate. The source makes a profound philosophical point here. Averages lie.
Averages lie.
Yeah.
I want to spend some time on this because it challenges how most of us consume news and data. Explain the mechanics of an average lying.
Let's use a non-famous example first. If you look at a town's real estate data, the average crime rate might be statistically close to zero. It looks perfectly safe on a macro level. But if you segment the data block by block, you might find that out of 100,000 homes, only one single house at the end of a specific cul-de-sac has been robbed 10 times in a month. On average, the town is safe. But if you live in that one specific house, you are in a persistent crisis.
So the macro view obscures the micro reality.
Exactly. In business, a global company might report flat overall sales to Wall Street. The CEO thinks they are stable. But if the consultant doesn't strictly segment that data by product line or geography, they will completely miss the fact that segment A is growing at a massive 100% a year, while segment B is structurally collapsing at 25% a year and dragging the whole company down.
The source shared a real-world horror story about what happens when a massive industry fails to isolate the real hidden drivers of profitability, the 20-year price war.
This is one of the most chilling examples of hidden incentives manipulating global markets. The source worked with a client in a heavy industrial sector where, 10 years prior, prices for their main product were inexplicably slashed in half.
Just cut by 50% overnight.
Right. The entire industry panicked, followed suit, and bled cash, totally destroying the profit margins of an entire global sector for a decade. The source spent nearly a year trying to analytically solve why the market structure changed. They looked at macroeconomic factors, raw material costs, currency fluctuations. Nothing explained it.
Because it wasn't a macroeconomic shift at all. It was deeply, terrifyingly psychological.
It was a localized agency problem. Through rigorous segmentation, the source discovered that a decade prior, a single manager of a specific mid-tier business unit at a rival firm had his personal compensation plan restructured by HR.
And what was the new incentive?
His massive multi-million-dollar annual bonus was suddenly tied exclusively to unit volume shipped, completely decoupled from net profitability.
Wow. So the manager optimized entirely for his own personal bonus at the expense of his company and the entire industry.
He hacked the prices in half because he knew it would move a massive volume of physical product out the door. He triggered a global industry price war, successfully secured his personal multi-million-dollar bonus, and structurally destroyed the industry's profitability for 20 years.
That is wild.
And the most terrifying part. Competitors blindly followed his pricing without ever understanding why he dropped prices in the first place. They assumed he had discovered a new supply chain efficiency. If you don't use a strict framework to segment costs, revenues, and hidden human incentives, you will never find the rogue manager who burned down a global market for a personal payout.
That perfectly transitions us to the second major analytical tool, the business situation framework. This is utilized when the math isn't necessarily the problem, but the core strategy is.
Yes.
The framework forces the consultant to look at 4 distinct pillars: customer, product, company, and competition. And the source uses a massive global example to demonstrate this: the National Basketball Association considering entering the Chinese market.
A classic high-stakes market entry problem. The host plays the role of the consultant deconstructing a pilot program where the NBA broadcast a few games in China.
Right.
The consultant must systematically walk through the framework, isolating variables so they aren't overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the question. First, they look at customer demand. The data reveals a staggering 100 million viewers for a single pilot program.
Huge numbers.
Massive. The demographics are heavily skewed toward young men who actually play basketball recreationally. Furthermore, the potential advertisers are massive Fortune 500 multinationals, companies like Procter & Gamble or Nike, who are absolutely desperate to reach this exact elusive demographic in Asia.
So the demand side is an absolute goldmine. Then the framework forces them to look at competition.
And the competition is virtually non-existent. You have native Chinese programming, which at the time was heavily state-controlled, largely depressing Communist Party channels.
I remember the source joking about taking his grandmother to a movie in China where every character dies tragically at the end. She casually explains, that's normal because it makes you feel like your real life is better than the movies.
Yeah, compared to that bleak media landscape, an NBA game featuring Michael Jordan in his prime is an absolute revelation.
Of course.
The data showed that overseas content made up only 20% of the programming hours available on television, but it was capturing 80% of the total viewership. And then the consultant looks at barriers to entry. It is notoriously, historically difficult to get regulatory approval to broadcast foreign media in China.
But the NBA had an edge there too.
They did. The data reveals the NBA had already secured a rare 10-year pilot agreement with the government.
Let's summarize the board here. They have massive, proven demand. They have desperate Fortune 500 advertisers ready to write checks. They have zero real entertainment competition. And they possess a 10-year regulatory moat blocking any rival sports league from copying them. I'm going to play devil's advocate and push back here. This sounds way too perfect.
It does.
It sounds like a fairy tale.
Yeah.
What is the blind spot? How does a linear thinker not just blindly stamp, yes, invest immediately on this, and walk away?
That is the exact vulnerability of human optimism, and it is the beauty of a rigid, emotionless framework. The framework forces you to look at the company branch even when the external market looks like a guaranteed lottery ticket.
So looking internally at the NBA.
Right. The consultant must pause the excitement and ask, what is the NBA's global financial situation internally right now? And the interviewer throws a massive curveball. The NBA's global operations, primarily in the U.S., are currently bleeding cash. They're losing tens of millions of dollars a year globally due to labor disputes and declining domestic ratings.
Suddenly the entire context of the decision shifts.
Completely. The initial capital investment to set up operations in China might only be $2 million, which is a tiny fraction of their global operating costs. But if the core domestic business is facing an existential liquidity crisis, tying up precious capital and, more importantly, executive focus in a highly complex, politically sensitive foreign market expansion could be the exact distraction that bankrupts the entire organization.
So it's about sequencing.
Exactly. The framework forces the consultant to strip away the emotion and say, the market is perfect, the demand is perfect, but your internal financial timing is disastrous. Fix your house before you build an empire.
It isolates the variables so the executive team doesn't get intoxicated by the upside. This is fascinating. Let's push this analysis further. We've looked at the frameworks for expanding into new, hungry markets. But what happens when the market you currently dominate starts collapsing beneath your feet?
That's a much harder problem to diagnose.
Right. How does a linear thinker diagnose a dying industry? The source presents a tension-filled scenario about an advertising giant, let's call him Omega.
The Omega case is a masterclass in reading invisible macroeconomic structural shifts through micro-level data. Omega is a legacy, billion-dollar global advertising agency. Their sales have been completely flat at 0% growth for 3 consecutive years. The CEO is furious and wants to know why.
Naturally.
A poor consultant will immediately jump into Omega's internal operations, looking at overhead, firing mid-level managers, trying to cut costs, but a great consultant immediately asks for the macroeconomic industry comparison.
They ask, is this just an Omega problem, or is this happening to everyone?
Yes. And the extracted data reveals a startling truth. While Omega is completely flat at 0% growth, the advertising industry as a whole is growing at 5% annually. Omega is actively losing market share, but they don't know to whom. So the consultant systematically segments the industry competitors.
Breaking it down.
They break the advertising world into categories: global brand agencies, direct mail operations, media buyers, and digital interactive agencies.
And here is where the aha moment hits.
The segmented data shows that the global brand agencies, which is Omega's exact core peer group, are actually shrinking as a whole, but the digital and interactive agencies are exploding, growing at 30% per year.
It's a massive structural shift. The Fortune 500 clients are abandoning traditional cinematic TV and glossy print brand building and pouring all their capital into measurable, mathematical online advertising.
Because the end consumers of those Fortune 500 companies are shifting their attention away from network television and toward the internet. The money is simply following the eyeballs. The consultant realizes and must explain to the CEO that Omega isn't actually doing anything wrong in their traditional business. Their campaigns are still beautiful. Their traditional business is simply becoming structurally obsolete.
So what's the solution? If you are the CEO of Omega and you realize the world is moving digital, you just hire a bunch of digital engineers, right? You build a digital wing within your agency.
Well, this is where the deep second-order synthesis of the elite consultant comes into play. The consultant analyzes the underlying culture and product of both sides. Omega creates highly emotional cinematic television art. To do that, they hire artists, film directors, and creatives who trust their gut instincts.
Right.
The digital agencies, on the other hand, provide predictive statistics, database marketing, and highly measurable return on investment. To do that, they hire PhDs, statisticians, and software engineers who only trust a p-value.
It's a total cultural and product mismatch. They operate on entirely different belief systems.
If Omega tries to build a digital agency internally, the artists and the statisticians will go to war. The creatives will feel stifled by the math. The engineers will feel the art is unquantifiable nonsense. They literally speak different corporate languages.
So they can't do it in-house.
Therefore, the consultant deduces a harsh reality. Omega cannot build this capability organically fast enough to catch the 30% growth wave. They are forced into a merger and acquisition strategy. They must use their only remaining asset, their massive access to Fortune 500 boardrooms, to acquire a dominant, pure-play digital agency, let's call them eCool, in order to survive the structural shift.
They use their legacy relationships to buy the math required to save the art. That is brilliant. But let's look at another structural dynamic the source mentions, which completely upends how most people think about business: the mechanics of high fixed cost industries. You mentioned earlier the joke the source made about the airline industry.
Oh, it's one of the great dark economic paradoxes. The source notes that as a 20-something with a personal net worth of exactly $1, he was technically richer than the entire United States airline industry's combined profits over its first 50-year history.
Which sounds insane. How is that practically possible? We all buy plane tickets. We know they're incredibly expensive. How does an entire global industry operate at a net loss for half a century?
Because airlines operate in an extreme, high fixed cost environment. It costs hundreds of millions of dollars in capital expenditure to buy a fleet of commercial jets. You have to lease terminal gates at airports. You have to pay highly unionized flight crews and maintenance teams.
Right, you're bleeding cash before anyone even boards.
Those are massive fixed costs, and you pay them every single day, whether the plane is completely empty or completely full. But the variable cost, the actual cost of adding one additional passenger to a plane that is already scheduled to fly, is essentially just a bag of peanuts and a negligible splash of jet fuel. The variable cost is almost zero.
A commercial flight is a highly perishable good. Unlike a warehouse full of shoes that you can sell next month, a flight from New York to Los Angeles at 8:00 a.m. on a Tuesday ceases to exist at 8:01 a.m. So the incentive structure gets totally warped.
It completely breaks rational economic behavior. If a plane is about to take off with 50 empty seats, the airline is desperate to get any revenue for those seats to help chip away at their massive, crushing debt obligations. So, 30 minutes before the flight, they slash the price of a ticket to $50.
Just to get something.
But then, rival competitors see that price drop and match it, fearing they will lose market share. Suddenly, the entire industry is locked in a suicidal race to the bottom, constantly pricing tickets well below the actual total cost of operation just to generate immediate cash flow.
So the structure forces them into bad decisions.
High fixed costs drive perfectly rational corporate actors into completely irrational, value-destroying, predatory behaviors.
But high fixed costs aren't just a trap. They can also be weaponized by a visionary. The source talks about Amazon and Jeff Bezos during the dot-com bubble in 1998.
The construction of the Amazon mode. In the late 90s, Amazon was essentially just an online bookstore. It was a completely virtual, high-margin, low-fixed-cost business. When a customer ordered a book, Amazon just passed the order to a wholesaler who drop-shipped it. Amazon held no inventory.
That sounds like a great business model.
It was, but because the fixed costs were so incredibly low, the barrier to entry was practically zero. Anyone with a server in their garage could copy the model. And they did. There were thousands of copycat digital bookstores popping up overnight.
Because everyone thought e-commerce meant the end of physical inventory. So what did Bezos do?
He looked at the low-cost model, realized it offered no long-term protection, and intentionally set fire to it. He raised massive amounts of capital from Wall Street and deliberately burned $300 million to build massive physical warehouses and logistics centers across the country.
Which Wall Street must have hated.
Wall Street analysts absolutely hated it. They screamed that he was destroying his profit margins and turning a sleek digital tech company into a clunky physical logistics business. But Bezos wasn't optimizing for short-term quarterly margins. He was building a massive fixed-cost barrier to entry.
Because if you want to compete with Amazon today, you don't just need a clever website and a server. You need $10 billion to build a physical logistics and delivery empire that spans the globe.
Exactly. He weaponized fixed costs to lock out the thousands of digital copycats. He fundamentally changed the entire economic structure of the e-commerce industry to ensure his eventual monopoly. It is a stunning example of long-term strategic foresight overriding the consultant's typical desire for short-term profitability.
Which is incredible, but it serves as a perfect pivot. We spent the last half hour marveling at the sheer analytical horsepower of this consultant framework. It is undeniably effective at optimizing the present. But I want to talk about the psychological toll of this extreme linear thinking. How does this kind of endless, ruthless optimization rewire a human brain?
It creates a severe, almost inescapable cognitive distortion. When your entire professional survival, your identity, and your compensation depend on segmenting, isolating, and optimizing inefficiencies, you literally cannot turn the machine off when you leave the office.
You can't just be a normal person anymore.
Right. The source shares a hilarious but deeply revealing, somewhat tragic anecdote about being on a date. He is standing in line at a casual restaurant, and instead of engaging in conversation with his date, his brain automatically begins doing process redesign math on the restaurant's operations.
If 100 people move through this line every hour, and we rearrange the physical layout to shave 10 seconds off the cashier wait time, we can increase throughput by.
Exactly that. He is mentally restructuring the restaurant's bottleneck efficiency, calculating lost revenue per square foot, while his date is probably wondering why he's staring blankly at the cash register and ignoring her.
That's rough.
It makes these individuals highly effective corporate surgeons, but frankly, terrible social partners. They are cursed to see the entire world, traffic jams, grocery stores, human relationships, entirely as a series of broken systems waiting to be optimized.
And the ultimate absurd expression of this worldview is the famous McKinsey cookie analysis.
This anecdote is the perfect encapsulation of the consultant mind taken to its logical, sociopathic extreme. In the New York office of a major firm, there was a persistent rumor that consultants were overworked, stressed, and not getting enough breaks. During a Friday office-wide meeting, one consultant stood up and rigorously pitched the managing partner of the office on a proposal to officially ban all free snacks and cookies from the employee break room.
Let me guess. He didn't propose this because he was worried about the team's general health and wellness.
No, the motivation was entirely financial, and you have to listen to the math he used. He stood up and calculated on a whiteboard. There are 1,000 employees in this specific office. If each person eats an average of one free cookie a day, at an estimated 300 calories per cookie, over 252 working days a year, that equates to 45 million total calories consumed annually by the office.
The granularity is insane.
It gets worse. He then projected that 45 million excess calories equals an average weight gain of roughly 2 pounds per consultant per year. Because the consulting firm is self-insured for healthcare, meaning the firm pays the medical bills directly rather than using an outside insurance company, he calculated that this mathematically predictable weight gain would result in a higher incidence of cardiovascular disease and diabetes, leading to a $2 million increase in the firm's healthcare costs over a 10-year period.
So his conclusion was?
Therefore, his ultimate strategic recommendation was to save $2 million in amortized healthcare liabilities, ban the cookies.
And what was the response from the head of the office to this brilliant presentation?
The head of the office just stared at him for a long moment and said, "Obviously, we are not keeping you busy enough in this office."
It's hilarious, but it's also slightly terrifying. If you train a mind to view every single human action strictly through the lens of caloric input and long-term amortized healthcare liabilities, you strip away all sense of humanity. But this raises a profound structural question about the filter itself. If this entire global pipeline is perfectly engineered to select for the guy who can calculate the 10-year healthcare cost of a chocolate chip cookie, who is it systematically filtering out? Who fails this system?
The source reveals a shocking truth that the consulting industry rarely admits publicly. True visionaries and creative geniuses make absolutely terrible consultants. They fail the filter completely.
People like Steve Jobs, Richard Branson, or the founders of major tech startups?
Steve Jobs, Richard Branson, Elon Musk, top-tier venture capitalists, they would all likely bomb a first-round McKinsey interview. These individuals operate on massive, nonlinear jumps of intuition. They have famously short attention spans. They jump from product design to marketing strategy to supply chain without using a rigid step-by-step framework. But most importantly, their defining characteristic is that they make massive existential bets on the future without existing data.
Because in the consulting world we just outlined, acting without data is rule number one of what not to do. Never without data-driven justification.
Right. A visionary founder invents a future that has no historical data. A top-tier venture capitalist evaluates the psychological resilience and charisma of a founder operating in a market category that doesn't even exist yet. There is no historical Excel spreadsheet to segment.
Because the market isn't there yet.
Because elite consulting firms structurally demand historical data to mathematically prove their logic, they are notoriously terrible at forecasting new technologies, paradigm shifts, or black swan events.
Let me challenge the entire premise of global consulting based on that exact point. If we, as a global society, are letting highly linear, risk-averse, hyper-data-obsessed minds design the long-term strategies of our biggest multinational companies, aren't we optimizing for the present at the direct expense of revolutionary innovation? Are these elite firms actually capable of building the future, or are they just making the existing outdated machine run 5% faster?
That is the ultimate, inescapable third-order effect of this entire global ecosystem. Consulting firms do not invent new machines. They optimize the machines that already exist. They are the ultimate highly paid managers of the status quo.
So they play it safe.
Extremely safe. If a CEO wants to take a massive risk and create a brand new, world-changing product category, a consulting firm will almost always advise against it. Why? Because the available historical data will inevitably show a high statistical probability of failure for new ventures. The consultant mindset prevents catastrophic corporate losses, which is why boards of directors love them, but it also structurally strangles the kind of reckless, nonlinear, visionary risks that drive true human progress.
But the firms themselves aren't totally blind to this dynamic, though, right?
Yeah.
How is the game changing inside these elite institutions as they realize the limitations of their own filter?
The firms are beginning to adapt largely because they realized they were hiring brilliant linear math savants who were essentially unpresentable to human clients. So they started altering the interview process. They introduced group case interviews.
What exactly does a group interview test for that a solo one doesn't?
It tests for collaboration. Or, more accurately, it is designed to aggressively weed out the sociopaths. The firms realized that if you put 3 hyper-competitive Harvard, Stanford, and Wharton grads in a small room and ask them to solve a complex problem together, the ones lacking emotional intelligence will inevitably try to aggressively dominate the conversation, interrupt their peers, and steal credit to look like the smartest person in the room.
And the firm doesn't want that.
The firm immediately rejects those dominant people. Why? Because if a candidate acts like an arrogant jerk with their own peers in an interview, they will absolutely insult a client CEO in the real world and get the firm fired.
But there is a massive irony embedded at the very peak of this industry, isn't there? The career path from a junior analyst grinding out spreadsheets to a senior partner running a global division.
Oh, it is the ultimate contradiction of the elite corporate world. You are hired out of Stanford or Harvard purely for your extreme top 0.01% analytical and mathematical skills. If you survive the initial 90% pull, you are promoted to a management role based on your emotional intelligence and your ability to handle difficult clients without them yelling at you.
And then?
But to reach the absolute apex of the pyramid, to become a partner and make millions of dollars a year, you have to become a salesperson.
A salesperson. Literally the most blue-collar of business skills.
The source points out that sales is historically viewed as a gritty blue-collar skill. It is rarely, if ever, taught as a core curriculum at elite academic institutions like Harvard, Stanford, or Yale. They teach corporate finance and macroeconomic theory.
Not cold calling.
Right. And yet, the only possible way to become a partner at a top global strategy firm is to master the art of bringing in new, multi-million-dollar consulting contracts. You spend your entire academic life perfecting high-level analytics, only to realize that the ultimate prize requires the exact skill set of a door-to-door vacuum salesman, just scaled up to the Fortune 500 level.
And sales requires a very specific type of communication. It requires stripping away the complexity you spent years building. That brings us to the final, perhaps most crucial skill of the consultant, the pyramid principle. How do you take months of ocean-boiling data, thousands of hours of analysis, and present it to a CEO who has exactly 5 minutes of attention to give you?
This concept highlights the crucial difference between analysis and synthesis. Analysis is pulling the Lego house apart to look at every individual plastic block, measuring it, weighing it. Synthesis is putting it back together so it actually looks like a house again.
It's the so what.
Exactly. And the Swift delivers a brilliant, unforgettable analogy about how to communicate with highly powerful, highly stressed people. It's the house on fire analogy.
Deconstruct the house on fire for us.
Imagine your house is literally on fire. A poor communicator, acting much like a panicked child, will run up to you and start rambling chronologically about the data. I was playing with matches in the living room and my sister pushed me, and then the curtains caught fire and the smoke is really thick and I'm coughing. What do I do?
It's all raw data, it's chronological, but there is zero conclusion and zero actionable advice.
Exactly. Now, a good communicator will run up and simply say, "The house is on fire, we need to get out right now."
Which provides the conclusion and the action. Much better.
But the great communicator, the elite consultant utilizing the rigid structure of the pyramid principle, will run up to the CEO and say, "You must evacuate the house immediately." There are 3 factual reasons why. First, the fire is moving at 10 feet per second and will structurally consume the house in 60 seconds. Second, the only fire extinguisher is on the opposite side of the house and you cannot physically reach it in time. Third, you promised your wife you would keep the children safe, and if you leave them in a burning house, she will kill you. Therefore, we must evacuate now.
It is completely cold. It is highly structured. It delivers the ultimate conclusion first. It backs up that conclusion with 3 undeniable segmented data points covering physics, logistics, and human incentives, and it leaves absolutely no room for ambiguity or debate. That is the secret language of the boardroom.
It is the only way powerful people who are constantly overwhelmed with incredibly complex, high-stakes decisions can process reality and take immediate action. If you possess the intellect of a Nobel physicist, but you cannot synthesize your brilliance into that exact rigid pyramid structure, your brilliance is functionally useless to the global economy.
We have spent an hour deeply decoding the hyperlinear, data-obsessed framework that governs the highest levels of global corporate strategy. From the brutal filtering of 21-year-olds abandoned in Cleveland, to isolating the macroeconomic variables of the MBA expanding into China, to the dark sociopathic side of cookie-calorie analytics. We've seen how these minds build the world we live in.
It's a machine built on logic.
It is. But I want you, the listener, to consider this final thought. We live in a world that is increasingly defined by unprecedented, totally unmodelable global shocks. Overnight supply chain collapses, sudden generative AI disruptions, global pandemics, and highly unpredictable human behavior. The entire consultant framework we've explored today relies fundamentally on analyzing historical data to predict and optimize the future.
Which is their strength, but also their fatal flaw.
Right. Because what happens when the historical data becomes completely obsolete overnight? If the elite minds advising our global institutions, our governments, and our central banks are strictly forbidden by their own core rules from guessing the future without data, who is actually steering the ship when we sail off the edge of the map into entirely uncharted waters?
That is the multi-trillion-dollar question.
It really is. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Drop a comment below. Do you think the consultant mindset is saving global business or slowly suffocating innovation? Let's debate. That is something for you to mull over until our next deep dive.